President Volodymyr Zelenskyy outlines his plan for victory in Ukraine.
Ми, українці, разом з нашими партнерами, ми повинні змінити обставини так, щоб війна закінчилась.
But Ukraine's future could be determined by the political will of its allies.
I reaffirmed that NATO stands shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine now and into the future.
And we'll get some reaction to Zelensky's plan.
I think that Ukraine itself has showed us again and again that it does have the ability to outfox the Russian military.
Today's Wednesday, October 16th, and this is The Issue from VOA.
I'm Scott Walterman.
And I'm Lori London.
Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelenskyy.
Слава Україні!
Ukrainian President Zelenskyy unveiled his much-anticipated victory plan on Wednesday, which he says could end the current war with Russia no later than next year. Reuters correspondent Zachary Goldman brings us the highlights.
As Moscow's forces advance in the east and a bleak winter of power cuts looms,
Ми, українці,
Zelenskyy said victory rested on 5 points that were in the hands of Kyiv's Western allies.
війна закінчилась.
They included an invitation to join NATO and the freedom to use Western weapons to strike deeper into Russia. He said Kyiv needed what he called a, quote, comprehensive non-nuclear strategic deterrence package to protect against future threats from Russia, a Western role in protecting Ukraine's natural resources from Russian attack, and post-war pledges for reconstruction.
Українськими підрозділами.
The plan is a major test of the political will of Kyiv's key allies, who have poured in many billions of dollars of weapons to support Ukraine. NATO has said Ukraine is heading for membership, but has stopped short of issuing an invitation.
This is clearly Ukraine's victory plan, which we, of course, take note of, we will discuss.
NATO Chief Mark Rutte on Wednesday said he was aware of the details of Ukraine's victory plan, but did not directly respond to Kyiv's demand.
This is something which will take place behind closed doors.
Подталкивает натовцев к прямому конфликту.
Russia on Wednesday denounced the victory plan, saying Zelenskyy was trying to push NATO into a direct conflict with Moscow. Zelensky's proposal comes more than 2 years since Russian forces invaded Ukraine in the largest military conflict Europe has seen since the Second World War. The Ukrainian military managed to repel the initial Russian onslaught and even recapture swaths of territory. But as the sides settled into a grinding ground war in the east, Kyiv's forces found themselves outnumbered and under pressure. Moscow turned to unrelenting drone and missile attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. And next month's U.S. election could propel Donald Trump, who has been consistently skeptical of Ukraine aid, back to the White House.
Mr. President, welcome back to the White House. Welcome back to the Oval Office.
Zelenskyy met U.S. President Joe Biden, his key ally, in Washington at the end of September to present the plan.
Такого контролю.
Zelenskyy said he would travel to a summit of European Union leaders in Brussels on Thursday.
Zachary Goldman with Reuters.
U.S. President Joe Biden spoke with Zelenskyy on Wednesday about efforts to ramp up security assistance to Ukraine. Biden also announced a $425 million military aid package that includes air defense capability, air-to-ground munitions, armored vehicles, and additional critical weaponry.
One of the key points of Zelenskyy's plan, as we heard from the report by Zachary Goldman, is that they need more materiel, they need more weapons, more shells, more air defenses, more jet fighters to keep the war effort going.
A lot of it is just so ambitious, though, Scott, as far as his desire to have an invitation into NATO before the election in the U.S. here, which is obviously just weeks away. So much of Ukraine's future, though, does depend on support from allies and, most importantly, the United States.
You're not wrong. Joining us now for a deeper dive into what comes next for Ukraine's future is Doug Klain, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He's also policy analyst for Razom for Ukraine, which is a nonprofit humanitarian aid and advocacy organization.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, anytime.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has now outlined what he calls his victory plan, including a call to join NATO. Let's just start with your overall reaction on this victory plan.
So, unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., the victory plan was presented privately, when President Zelenskyy visited recently. And the reaction in D.C. has been a bit muted. These are all the points that are in this victory plan that President Zelenskyy has outlined are important points that would be significant for helping Ukraine and significant for helping to end the war and deter Russia in the future. But there's nothing really new, I think, from the perspective of the Biden administration and D.C. policymakers. These are all things that the Ukrainian government, President Zelenskyy in particular, have been quite vocal on already in calling for. He is reiterating them now and trying to formalize it as this victory plan. And it could be quite good framing as we talk about, what does the end of the war look like? How do we get a bridge to Ukraine's victory? But this, up to now, I don't think it's been too much of a game changer when it comes to the Biden administration's calculus. They don't seem to see this as anything new. Also,
two of the points that he's making are problematic: the continued military support and immediate invitation to NATO.
Yeah, especially with the immediate invitation to NATO. This is something that the Biden administration has said in the past. It's just not going to happen until the war ends. They don't see a meaningful difference between saying an invitation to NATO for Ukraine, inviting Ukraine to join the alliance at some point in the future, versus actually acceding to the alliance. Ukraine, on the other hand, does see a meaningful difference in it. They see almost a ladder of steps into the alliance of, first the NATO alliance in its communiques has said, Ukraine will join the alliance. Its path is irreversible, but that is not an invitation to join the alliance and start accession talks. Ukraine wants that invitation and wants to start formally the process, but that's not a line that the administration is willing to take right now.
And Zelenskyy said that in private communications with its partners that there has been increasing mention of negotiations and even less frequently the word justice. He says absolutely there's no negotiating as far as any sort of giving up territory. So where does he go from here?
I think that Ukraine is in a really crucial moment. The mood in Kyiv, I think, is quite dark. This hesitation that is coming from the United States at this moment is really casting this shadow. The administration continues to provide important security assistance to Ukraine, but the outcome of the U.S. presidential election is incredibly unclear, and it could dramatically alter what happens on the battlefield. Ukraine right now, if it wants to make big progress on the battlefield and try to achieve some sense of justice from Russia, it needs to mobilize men and try to take back more territory. But it also needs the weapons to equip newly mobilized soldiers. And while the United States continues to provide significant military assistance, it's not providing enough to properly equip tens or hundreds of thousands of new Ukrainian soldiers. And so Ukraine is stuck in this kind of limbo at the moment, waiting to see what happens, waiting to see if the United States can indeed deliver what Ukraine needs to make progress here.
There are a lot of people who believe, particularly people with military backgrounds, that regardless of the amount of material that's given to Ukraine and the amount of time they spend in the war, they cannot beat Russia. Do you agree with that?
I don't think so. I think that Ukraine itself has showed us again and again that it does have the ability to outfox the Russian military. most experts believed that this war was devolving into stalemate, into positional warfare, something akin to World War I, where both sides are stuck in their trenches. The presence of drones and surveillance means that they cannot achieve surprise against each other, and it's just going to be slugging it out with artillery. Ukraine proved in Kursk that it could still surprise Russia and use Western military equipment to get on the move and maneuver quickly, break through the weakest point in the Russian lines, and achieve surprise and success. But what's limiting Ukraine in some ways here is that it doesn't have the means and capability to keep replicating that kind of maneuver and success, to do more than just a one-off win like Kursk was. Ukraine is struggling to try to generate manpower and force to achieve some kind of a large-scale maneuver and breakthrough like that. Something that many were hoping could be achieved in the 2023 counteroffensive. As I said a second ago, this is a two-part equation. Ukraine needs to mobilize actual soldiers, but it needs its partners to equip those soldiers. And this is something that rests on both Ukraine and its partners. And that's, while there's a lot of these points in the victory plan that President Zelenskyy is calling for, when it comes to meaningful success on the battlefield, which Ukraine has showed it can achieve, this is one of the key things that it really needs. It needs time to generate that force and prepare for some kind of a future counteroffensive.
So can you sort of give an outline of what you think the scenario will look like as far as the U.S. election? If it's a Trump win, what happens to Ukraine and subsequently Europe? And if Kamala Harris wins the presidential election, do you see any changes, or is it more of basically the Biden administration or even a stepped up version?
Yeah, I see really three possible scenarios with the election. First, if Trump wins, he has been quite clear about how he approaches this. He wants to end the war quickly. He's told Putin and the world exactly what he wants to do. He wants to strike a deal. He's very open to Ukraine surrendering land and the millions of people that are on that land, about 3 million people, and swearing off NATO membership, maybe even EU membership. This is something that J.D. Vance has been quite specific about and that Trump has vaguely endorsed. And, he's willing to use U.S. military assistance as leverage to push Ukraine to the negotiating table on that. That's perhaps the bleakest scenario for Ukraine here, and I think it's what folks in Ukraine are particularly afraid of. If Kamala Harris wins, I think that there's maybe two likely scenarios. One, she does largely continue the Biden administration's policy of significant assistance to Ukraine, enough to keep Ukraine in the fight, but maybe not enough to win. Something can be historic, and U.S. assistance to Ukraine has indeed been historic, but it hasn't met the moment. It hasn't been enough for Ukraine to win. That is one possibility for a Harris administration. But another is that she goes a different path, that they go perhaps a bit bolder than the Biden administration has been willing to be. They surge military assistance to Ukraine. They lift restrictions on Ukraine using U.S. and other allied weapons to strike deep into Russia, to batter Russia's supply lines and logistics, and start trying to make things like the occupation of Crimea untenable, make Russian offensives untenable in the Donbass, and expand dramatically the training and equipping of new Ukrainian soldiers, enough to try to help Ukraine prepare for future counteroffensives, to do what they did in Kursk on a bigger scale, to do what they did in the Kharkiv region in 2022, again, to start really pushing the Russians back. And maybe they are, enabled to fully eject Russian forces from Ukraine, or at least to fundamentally change Putin's calculus and make him say, look, there is not a friendly U.S. administration coming in that will abandon Ukraine. There is not some hope that Russia has of winning on the battlefield. Our calculus as Russia has changed, and we have to stop these offensives in Ukraine and end the invasion in some way. That, I think, is is the most optimistic scenario for a Harris administration, and it's something that I think all advocates are hoping for.
President Biden is going to Germany, and one of the things they're going to talk about is Ukraine and the softening support in both countries from the populations, and it coupled with this growing rise of the right wing in both countries. And this is also being replicated in other Western democracies. People are tiring of the war, and there are right-wing gains politically. A lot of people believe that Putin is playing an attrition game, that he can wait the West out. How do these things play into that calculus?
These things absolutely play into that calculus for Russia. Right now, we're really at the critical moment that Putin has been waiting over a year for. Putin has hoped that he can wait out Ukraine's partners, that the U.S. has an election coming, and the U.S. will be cautious before that election in its support for Ukraine, and might even elect a president who will not continue support for Ukraine and will try to end the war and try to cut a deal with Russia and give Putin what he wants. And that may well happen in 3 weeks from the day of this interview. That is what Putin is hoping for. It's his best chance for success on the battlefield. All that the Russians are able to do on the battlefield right now is use their overwhelming artillery advantage to annihilate anything in front of them and slowly advance meter by meter. That's not a recipe for real battlefield success. They're hoping that Ukraine's partners will get tired, change leadership, and walk away from it. In Germany, this is something that we've really been seeing this year, unfortunately, as the German government has dramatically reduced its defense spending and what it's budgeting for assistance to Ukraine. That is coming as you said, as we're seeing really a resurgence of far right and populist political figures in Germany, as well as in much of the rest of Europe. France was rocked by this real surge of the far right, and it's something that President Macron has barely staved off as he's kept this government going. And the U.S. is about to come to one of these critical points. What we see in 3 weeks, it might be one of the most important moments for the war in Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion.
If the U.S. no longer is willing to support Ukraine as it has been, what does that mean for the survival of Ukraine as a country and for the rest of Europe? And for that matter, Zelensky's own safety?
Yeah. I think that in the last 2.5 years, we have forgotten the scenario that we were looking at on February 24th, 2022. Russia's plan was to blitzkrieg across Ukraine, to decapitate the democratically elected government of Ukraine, to kill or imprison Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership. Russia developed lists of Ukrainian journalists, intellectuals, local leaders, community activists who would be rounded up into detention camps and either detained or executed to stop them from fomenting resistance to the invasion. Russia devised ahead of the invasion a network of detention camps that stretches across Russia, and it's using it now to hold tens of thousands of detained Ukrainian civilians and almost 20,000 Ukrainian children that have been abducted. This would happen on a monumental scale if the United States and its partners walked away from Ukraine and stopped giving Ukraine what it needs to hold off Russia's invasion. These would be some of the worst crimes against humanity that we've seen in Europe since the Second World War. For decades, we have not seen something like what Russia had planned for Ukraine. And those are the stakes, when we're talking about what happens with U.S. support for Ukraine. People have forgotten what the stakes really were 2.5 years ago. And it never changed because Ukraine has done what we thought was impossible and held Russia back.
Grim, thank you so much for the time.
Thank Thank you guys both.
Doug Klain is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a policy analyst for Razom for Ukraine.
Well, that's a lot to take in, Lori.
It is, the implications, I think the Biden administration has been talking about that since this whole thing began, about the need to support Ukraine and its democracy so that another country can't just come in and take a sovereign nation and claim it as its own.
But as you heard, there is a growing sense among the populations of the Western alliance that it's not their war.
We may get a clearer picture in just a couple of weeks of what the future could potentially look like for Ukraine and potentially Europe as a whole. And of course, you and I will be talking about it every step of the way.
3 weeks till the U.S. election.
This has been The Issue from the Voice of America.
On behalf of everyone here at VOA, thanks so much for spending this time with us.
Follow The Issue on X and Facebook at VOA The Issue, and for news 24/7 on our website at voanews.com.
In Washington, I'm Scott Walterman.
And I'm Lori London. We'll see you tomorrow.